My name is Abigail. I'm 27 years old, and 11 years after my mother kicked me out and told me I'd be back begging, she's the one standing in my office with her hand out. The air in our house always smelled like expensive lavender and lies. I remember the way the late afternoon sun hit the polished mahogany of the banister as I tried to sneak past my mother's office. I was 16, and I moved like a ghost in my own home, holding my breath so the floorboards wouldn't betray me. In my hand was a thick envelope, the one I'd been waiting for. "Abigail?" Her voice was like a piano wire snapped tight. I froze. Elena stepped out into the hallway, her blonde hair perfectly coiffed, her silk blouse a shimmering shade of cream. She looked like a portrait of suburban success, but her eyes were cold, scanning me for any sign of rebellion. "What is that?" she asked, pointing at the envelope. "Nothing, just school stuff," I lied. My heart was a hammer against my ribs. She didn't ask again. She simply reached out and plucked it from my hand. I watched, paralyzed, as she tore it open. Her eyes moved quickly over the letterhead. The Cleveland Institute of Art, Summer Internship Selection. The silence that followed was heavier than the furniture. When she looked up, her face wasn't red with anger. It was white with a terrifying, calculated disappointment. "I told you to enroll in the pre-law seminar at the university," she said, her voice a low, dangerous hum. "I told you that our family doesn't produce starving artists. We produce professionals. We produce people who matter." "I don't want to be a lawyer, Mom. I want to build things. I want to design." "You want to embarrass me," she barked, the silk of her sleeve whistling as she slammed the letter onto the hall table. "You think I worked this hard, married into this neighborhood, and kept this house perfect just so you could throw it away on a hobby? You are a reflection of me, Abigail, and right now you are a smudge." The argument escalated into a blur of jagged words. I finally snapped. I told her I hated her perfect life. I told her the house felt like a tomb. That was the breaking point. 10 minutes later, I was standing on the manicured lawn. The grass was dew-slicked and cold against my sneakers. My duffel bag, stuffed haphazardly with a few sweaters and my sketchbook, lay at my feet like a dead animal. Elena stood on the porch, silhouetted by the warm, golden light of the foyer, a light I was no longer allowed to share. "Go then," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the quiet street. "See how much the world cares about your sketches when your stomach is empty. You're a child playing at being an adult." She took a step closer to the edge of the stairs, her face twisting into a sneer. "Mark my words, Abigail, you'll be back in 6 months, starving and begging me for a roof over your head. And when you do, I might just let you sleep in the garage. Now get off my property." The heavy oak door slammed shut. The click of the deadbolt echoed in the evening air like a gunshot. I stood there in the dark, the smell of my mother's lavender perfume still clinging to my skin, and realized I had exactly $40 in my pocket and nowhere to go. The first hour was a blur of adrenaline and spite. I walked until the lights of my mother's neighborhood, the glowing lanterns and the manicured hedges, faded into the hazy orange glow of the commercial district. My duffel bag felt like it was filled with lead, the strap digging a deep, angry trench into my shoulder. By midnight, the adrenaline had curdled into a cold, hollow fear. The bus station was a concrete cavern that smelled of stale cigarettes and floor wax. I sat on a plastic bench that was cracked in the middle, clutching my sketchbook to my chest like a shield. Every time the automatic doors hissed open, a draft of winter air bit at my ankles. I watched the clock. Each minute felt like an hour, the ticking sound mocking me. 6 months, my mother had said, starving and begging. "You look like you're about to vanish into thin air, kid." I jumped, my heart leaping into my throat. An older man stood a few feet away holding a mop bucket. He had a face like a crumpled map, deep lines around his eyes, and a gray beard that looked like it hadn't seen a razor in a month. He wore a stained apron over a flannel shirt. "I'm just waiting for the next bus," I said, my voice cracking. "The next bus isn't until 5 a.m., he said, leaning on his mop. He looked at my sketchbook, then at my expensive, salt-stained sneakers. He wasn't stupid. He knew exactly what a girl like me was doing in a place like this at 2 in the morning. "I'm Marcus. I run the diner across the street. It's 24 hours, and the heating actually works." I hesitated. My mother's voice rang in my head. "Don't talk to people like that. They'll take advantage of you." "I don't have much money," I whispered. Marcus chuckled, a dry, raspy sound. "I didn't ask for your wallet. I asked if you wanted to sit somewhere that doesn't smell like a urinal. I've got a window booth that needs a warm body to make the place look busy." I followed him. The diner was called the Rusty Spoon. It was a relic of the 80s. Cracked vinyl booths, a jukebox that only played country B-sides, and the thick, comforting scent of bacon grease and burnt coffee. Marcus slid a mug of hot cocoa in front of me. "Drink up. You're shivering so hard you're rattling the silverware." I wrapped my hands around the mug. The warmth was the first kind thing I'd felt in years. I opened my sketchbook and started to draw, not the fancy buildings I dreamed of, but Marcus's hands as he cleaned the counter, the way his knuckles were swollen, the way he moved with a slow, deliberate grace. "You've got a gift," Marcus said, pausing over my shoulder. "But a gift don't pay the rent. You got a place to stay?" "No," I said, looking down at the drawing. "Tell you what," he said, wiping the counter with a rag. "My waitress, Sarah, just quit to move to Vegas. I need someone to scrub tables and run plates for the graveyard shift. There's a storage room in the back. It's got a cot and a lock on the door. It ain't the Ritz, but it's dry." I hesitated. My mother's voice rang in my head. "Don't talk to people like that. They'll take advantage of you." "I'll work hard," I said, the words coming out stronger than I felt. "I know you will. People who leave home with nothing but a pencil usually do." That night, I didn't sleep on the cot. I sat up in the back room, watching the sun rise over the gas station across the street. I was 16, I was a waitress, and for the first time in my life, I was the only person who owned me. The first year was a blur of grease and geometry. My life became a series of loops. Wake up at 2 p.m. in the windowless storage room, the air thick with the scent of industrial-sized cans of tomato sauce. Scrub the floors until they shone like mirrors. Serve the 4 p.m. early birds, the 7 p.m. families, and the midnight truckers who looked at me with pity until they saw how fast I could calculate their change. In the quiet hours between 3 a.m. and 5 a.m., the diner became my studio. Marcus let me use the corner booth, the one with the cracked vinyl and the best view of the streetlights. While the rest of the town slept, I drew. I didn't draw people anymore. I drew the skeletons of buildings. I used the back of discarded order slips to sketch floor plans, reimagining the diner as a glass and steel cathedral. "You're gonna wear that pencil down to a splinter, Abby," Marcus said one night, sliding a plate of mistake pancakes onto the table. There was never really a mistake, he just knew I'd gone 14 hours without eating. "I have to get it right, Marcus. If the load-bearing walls aren't positioned here, the whole roof collapses in the draft," I muttered, my eyes bloodshot but focused. "You're 17 now," he said, leaning against the counter. "You've got your GED, you've got $3,000 stuffed in that shoebox under your pot. When are you going to stop building paper houses and go build real ones?" "I'm not ready," I whispered. The fear of failure was a physical weight, a ghost of my mother's voice telling me I'd be back on her porch, begging. "You're more ready than anyone I've ever met," he countered. He reached into his apron and pulled out a crumpled brochure for the Ohio State University's architecture program. That's a fancy way of saying kids who have more grit than money. I spent the next 3 years working double shifts. I was a waitress by night and a student by day. I learned to sleep in 20-minute bursts on the city bus. I learned how to make a single gallon of milk last 2 weeks. My hands, once soft and manicured, were now calloused and scarred from kitchen burns and the constant friction of a drafting pen. Every time I felt my knees buckle from exhaustion, I pictured Elena's face. I pictured the way she'd look down at me from that porch. I wasn't working for a degree. I was working for a shield. I was building a life that was so high, so sturdy, that she could never reach me again. By the time I was 21, I walked across a stage to accept my diploma. Marcus was the only person in the family and friends section. He wore a suit that was 20 years out of style and smelled faintly of fried onions, but he cheered louder than anyone else in the stadium. As I held that piece of paper, I didn't feel like a smudge. I felt like a foundation. I was done with the small town. I was done with the diner. It was time to go to Chicago, where the buildings touched the clouds. Chicago is a city of sharp edges and relentless winds, a place that rewards those who are made of steel. By the time I turned 27, I had become part of its skyline. I stood in my office on the 42nd floor, my palms pressed against the floor-to-ceiling glass. Below me, the city was a grid of shimmering lights, a living circuit board of ambition. My reflection looked back at me, dark hair pulled into a sleek, professional bun, a tailored charcoal blazer, and eyes that no longer looked like they were searching for a place to hide. I was no longer the girl with the $40 dream. I was an associate architect at Miller & Associates. "The final contracts are in, Abby," my assistant Leo said as he stepped into the office. He laid a leather-bound folder on my desk. "The condo is officially yours. Keys are at the front desk of the building." I picked up the folder. My fingers traced the embossed logo of the development. It was a building I had helped design, a brutalist masterpiece of concrete and glass overlooking the lake. I hadn't just bought a home, I had bought a piece of my own vision. "Thanks, Leo. Go home. It's late." Once he left, I sat in the silence of the high-rise. I thought about the storage room at the diner. I thought about the smell of Marcus's old flannel shirt. I still sent him a check every month, not because he asked, but because he was the only person who had ever invested in me when my stock was at zero. He always called to complain that it was too much, but I knew he was using it to fix the diner's leaky roof. I hadn't spoken to my mother in 11 years. Not a phone call, not a birthday card. I had blocked her number and changed my own 3 times. Occasionally, I'd see a photo of her in the social section of the Ohio newspapers I sometimes scanned online. Elena, looking regal at a charity gala, or Elena at a country club brunch. She looked exactly the same, frozen in a world of curated perfection. I took the elevator down to the garage and drove to my new home. The condo was still empty, smelling of fresh paint and expensive wax. I didn't bring any furniture from my old apartment. I wanted a clean slate. I walked to the center of the living room and sat on the floor, the polished hardwood cool against my legs. I pulled a bottle of wine and a single glass from my bag. "I did it, Mom," I thought. Though the words didn't feel like a jab, they felt like a period at the end of a very long, very painful sentence. I'm not in a garage. I'm in the sky. I was at peace. My life was a structure I had built myself, brick by hard-earned brick. It was earthquake-proof. It was fire-resistant. Or so I thought, until the following Tuesday when a certified letter landed on my desk. It wasn't a bill, and it wasn't a contract. It was a legal notice of foreclosure. But it wasn't for my property. It was for the house with the mahogany banister and the lavender-scented hallways. My childhood home was being seized by the bank, and my name had been flagged in the system as the only surviving kin with a verifiable income. The shield I'd built for 11 years suddenly felt very thin. The letter sat on my mahogany desk, its white edges looking sharp enough to draw blood. I stared at the name of the law firm in the top left corner. It was based in my hometown in Ohio. I didn't open it immediately. I went to the break room and poured a cup of coffee I didn't want, watching the steam curl into the air. My hands were steady, a byproduct of years spent drafting precise lines, but my chest felt like it was being tightened by a winch. When I finally pulled the letter open, the legalese felt like a cold splash of water. Elena's house, the fortress of her vanity, was being liquidated. There were unpaid taxes, a defaulted mortgage, and a list of creditors that spanned 3 pages. I did something I hadn't done in a decade. I searched for her name online. The headlines in the local paper told the story that the letters hadn't. Local businessman Richard Vane missing amidst embezzlement investigation. Richard was the man Elena had married 2 years after she kicked me out. He was old money, according to the few letters from old school friends I'd accidentally seen before burning. But the money hadn't been old, it had been stolen. He'd drained Elena's accounts, took a second mortgage on the house without her knowing, or perhaps with her blind signature, and vanished into the ether, leaving her with nothing but the clothes in her walk-in closet and a mountain of debt. I leaned back in my leather chair, the city of Chicago humming outside my window. I should have felt a rush of vindication. I should have laughed. Instead, I felt a strange, hollow ache. It wasn't pity, not yet, but a profound sense of irony. The smudge was now the only one with a pen that could sign a check. The next day, my receptionist buzzed my desk. Her voice sounded hesitant. Abigail? There's a woman here to see you. She doesn't have an appointment, but she says she's your mother." The silence that followed was so thick I could almost hear the dust motes dancing in the sunlight. My first instinct was to say no, to have security escort her out, to let her feel the weight of the pavement under her feet, just like I had at 16. "Abigail?" The intercom crackled again. "Send her in," I said. My voice sounded like it belonged to someone else. The door opened slowly. Elena didn't storm in. She didn't command the room with her usual scent of expensive lavender and judgment. She hesitated at the threshold. She was wearing a trench coat that was slightly too large. Her hair, once a sculpted crown of gold, was thin and streaked with gray. She looked like a sketch of the woman I remembered, drawn by a hand that was shaking. She looked at my office, her eyes widening as they took in the awards on the wall, the scale models of the skyscrapers I'd built, and the panoramic view of the lake. "Abigail," she whispered. Her voice was thin, brittle as dry leaves. "Hello, Elena," I said. I didn't call her Mom. That word felt like a foreign language I'd forgotten how to speak. "I assume you're here about the house." She didn't answer right away. She walked to the window, looking out at the city she'd always told me would swallow me whole. Then she turned back to me, and for the first time in my life, I saw her lower her head. "I have nowhere else to go," she said. The words were quiet, but they felt like a tectonic shift. "They're taking everything. I need your help." The woman who told me I'd be back begging was now standing in my sky palace, her hands trembling as she clutched a cheap vinyl purse.
I didn't offer her a seat. I stayed behind my desk, the heavy weight of the polished oak acting as a barrier between my current life and the ghost of my past. The silence in the room wasn't peaceful. It was a vacuum, sucking the air out of my lungs. "You're an architect," Elena said, her eyes darting toward a scale model of the Riverwalk project on my side table. "A successful one. I saw the article in the Chronicle. You look different." 11 years will do that," I replied. My voice was as flat as a spirit level. "I'm surprised you found me. I thought you said I'd be easy to find because I'd be the one knocking on your door, starving." Elena winced, a flicker of the old fire sparking in her eyes before dying out. She looked down at her boots, scuffed leather that had once been expensive but were now salt-stained and worn at the heels. "I made a mistake, Abigail, about Richard, about many things. He's gone. He took the accounts, the savings, even the jewelry. The bank gave me 72 hours before they locked the doors. If I lose that house, I have nothing. I'll be on the street." She took a step toward the desk, her hands reaching out as if to touch the wood, but she pulled back at the last second. "I need $80,000, she whispered, "just to catch up on the back taxes and the primary mortgage. It's a drop in the bucket for someone like you, isn't it? Look at this place." I felt a cold laugh bubble up in my throat, but I suppressed it. A drop in the bucket? I spent 3 years eating expired canned soup and sleeping in a room the size of your walk-in closet to afford the tuition for the degree that built this office. I worked 80-hour weeks while you were hosting garden parties with money that wasn't even yours. "I'm your mother," she snapped, a sudden sharp echo of the woman on the porch. But then her shoulders slumped and the bravado vanished. Tears began to track through the heavy foundation on her cheeks. "Please, I'm begging you, Abigail, don't make me go to a shelter. I've lived in that house for 30 years. It's all I have left of my dignity." I looked at her, and for a fleeting second I saw her, not the monster who threw my bags into the dirt, but a frightened woman who had built her entire identity on a foundation of sand. She didn't want a relationship with me. She didn't want to know about my life or the buildings I'd designed. She wanted a bailout. She was exactly where she predicted I would be. She was the one standing in a lobby, desperate and hollowed out. "Wait here," I said. I stood up and walked out of the office, needing the sterile, air-conditioned hallway to clear the smell of her cheap, desperate perfume from my head. I walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows at the end of the hall and looked out at the Riverie. The 3-act structure of my life was reaching its peak. I had the power to crush her with a single no. I could let her feel the cold of the bus station and the smell of the grease. I could let her learn the lessons I had to learn at 16. But as I watched the boats cutting through the water below, I realized that if I acted out of pure revenge, I was still the girl on the lawn, defined by Elena's cruelty. To be truly free of her, I had to be something she never was, pragmatic. I turned back toward my office, my mind made up. When I walked back into the office, Elena was standing by my desk, her fingers hovering over a silver-framed photograph of Marcus and me on my graduation day. She looked up, her expression a fragile mask of hope. "I've made a decision," I said, sitting down. I didn't invite her to do the same. "Oh, Abigail, thank God," she exhaled, her shoulders dropping 2 inches. "I knew you wouldn't let your own mother end up in a shelter. I've already spoken to the bank's attorney. If we can get the wire transfer through by Friday—" "I'm not paying for the house, Elena." The words hit the room like a physical weight.
Elena's mouth stayed open, a small, silent O of shock. The hope vanished, replaced by a frantic, jagged confusion. What? But I just told you, it's all I have. If you don't pay the arrears, they'll auction it. Everything I've worked for, the reputation, the history, it'll be gone. No, I said, leaning forward. It's everything you stole. It's a monument to a life you couldn't actually afford, built on the backs of people you looked down on. I will not spend a single cent of my hard-earned money to maintain a lie. You're being cruel, she hissed, her voice trembling with a mix of rage and terror. You're doing this to punish me for that night. I'm doing this because I'm an architect. I know when a foundation is rotten. You can't save a building when the soil beneath it is nothing but sand. That house is gone, Elena. Accept it. She slumped into the guest chair then, the strength finally leaving her legs. She looked small, smaller than I ever thought possible. The silence stretched between us, filled only by the distant hum of the office ventilation and the ticking of the clock on my wall. "So that's it?" she whispered to her lap. "You're going to watch me sleep on a park bench?" I didn't say that. I pulled a legal pad toward me and wrote down 3 addresses. I have called a real estate contact in Ohio. There are 3 modest 1-bedroom apartments available for rent in a quiet part of town, far from your old neighborhood. I will pay the security deposit and the first 12 months of rent. I will also provide a monthly stipend for groceries and utilities. She looked at the paper as if it were covered in ash. An apartment? In that part of town? Abigail, I can't live there. People will see me. They'll know. Then you can find another way, I said, standing up. The interview was over. But here are my conditions. You will attend financial counseling and grief therapy. I will pay the providers directly, and you will not, under any circumstances, use my name or my firm to solicit loans or social favors. If you break these terms, the lease ends and the stipend stops. I walked around a desk and opened the door. You told me I'd be begging for a roof over my head. I'm giving you a roof. It's just not the one you wanted. It's a fresh start, Elena. Whether you use it to build something real or just sit in the dark and mourn your silk curtains is up to you. She stood up slowly, clutching the piece of paper with the addresses. She didn't look at me as she walked past. She looked at the floor, her shadow stretching out long and thin across the expensive carpet of the office hallway. As the door clicked shut behind her, I didn't feel the rush of victory I had imagined as a teenager. I just felt a profound sense of lightness. The debt was settled. Not her debt to the bank, but the debt I felt I owed to my own past. I was no longer the girl on the lawn, and she was no longer the queen on the porch. We were just 2 women in a very large, very indifferent world. 6 months passed. That was the timeline my mother had given me nearly 12 years ago, the window she predicted it would take for the world to break me. It felt poetic, or perhaps just ironic, that 6 months after she stood in my office, I found myself driving down the familiar cracked asphalt of my hometown. I didn't drive toward the hill where the mansions sat like silent stone sentinels. Instead, I pulled into the gravel lot of the Rusty Spoon. The neon sign still flickered, missing the Y, so it just read the Rust Spoon. But the smell of coffee and toasted sourdough hit me like a warm blanket the moment I stepped inside. Marcus was behind the counter, wiping down the same spot he'd been cleaning since I was 16. "You look like you've seen a ghost, Abby," he said, his eyes crinkling as a wide grin broke through his beard. "Just memories, Marcus," I said, sliding onto a stool. I told him about the apartment, the stipend, and the quiet, terse emails I received from my mother's court-appointed therapist. Elena was surviving. She wasn't happy. Happiness required a level of self-reflection she wasn't quite ready for, but she was sober, she was housed, and for the first time in her life, she was living within the means of a world that didn't owe her anything. "You did a hard thing, Marcus," said Marcus, sliding a slice of apple pie toward me. "Most people would have either given her everything or given her nothing. You gave her a floor. That's more than she gave you." "I didn't do it for her, Marcus. I did it so I wouldn't have to wonder where she was every time it rained." After I left the diner, I drove past my childhood home one last time. The foreclosure sign was gone, replaced by a sold banner. A young couple was out front, the man painting the front door a bright, cheerful blue, a color Elena would have found tacky. A child's bicycle lay in the grass where my bags had once been thrown. The house looked smaller. The mahogany banister and the lavender-scented halls no longer held the power to haunt me. It was just wood and plaster, a structure that had served its purpose and passed on to someone else. I drove back toward Chicago as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the Ohio fields in shades of bruised purple and gold. I thought about the structures I spent my days designing. A good building isn't just about the height or the glass, it's about how it handles the pressure of the wind and the weight of the world. My mother had tried to build a life out of mirrors, reflecting only what she wanted people to see. I had built mine out of the scrap metal and grit I found in a diner storage room. As the Chicago skyline finally rose in the distance, a jagged, beautiful heartbeat against the dark sky, I realized I was no longer waiting for the other shoe to drop. I wasn't looking over my shoulder for a woman on a porch. The prophecy was fulfilled, but not in the way she intended. I had come back to the beginning, but I wasn't begging. I was whole. And as I turned onto the lakefront drive toward my own home, I knew that the most beautiful thing I had ever designed wasn't made of concrete or steel. It was the life I had chosen for myself.